The last house I burglarized was 3 years ago. I'd been doing it for damn near a decade before that house and was extremely talented in getting in and out without ever being detected. I would spend weeks picking my target, making sure it was nobody I could have ever crossed paths with, and then weeks after that casing the house and learning everything I could. When I finally decided to make my move, there was no closet I didn't know about, no dog I hadn't befriended in the yard, and no camera whose blind spot I couldn't exploit. This last house was the home of Winston and Mary Manchester, a couple in their mid-80s who gained their wealth after Mary's parents were killed in an accident involving faulty motor mounts in a particularly popular line of cars. Mary was in her late 20s at the time and took the car manufacturer to court in a settlement that ended up being just over $500 million, with a regular annual payment of $100,000 in order to keep Mary and Winston quiet about the accident. With that money, they traveled the world collecting all sorts of extravagant objects, each worth a small fortune to someone like me who lived in a 9900 square foot apartment. They had authentic spears crafted by the Bushmen of Africa, vases from the Ming Dynasty, hand-spun Persian rugs, and so on. Their house was a reflection of their wealth and adventures, and now served as a memory bank in their old age. I spent months learning every inch of their house and everything there was to know about Mr. and Mrs. Manchester. I knew their routines, their history, their personal information, everything. I know that in the books and movies I'm supposed to say this would be my biggest payday and my last job and all that jazz, but to be honest, I had nothing but plans of future heists after this one. True, it would be my biggest score to date, but I never intended it to be my last. When the day came, I was wired with excitement and energy. I always got a serious buzz when breaking into someone's house, and this was to be no different. I waited until Sunday afternoon. Being religious, I could always count on 3 hours at least on Sundays during which the couple would drive into town and attend church services. Sometimes it lasted as long as 4 or 5 hours, but never less than 3. The trick to getting into someone's house is simple, but easy to mess up. All you have to do is act like you belong there, and if someone sees you, they won't think anything of it. If you're lurking around corners doing your best not to be seen, that may work for a time, but the second someone sees you, your ass is in the back of a cop car. As soon as I see the car back out of the driveway and disappear down the street, I don my orange vest and white hat with the power company logo on it, grab my work bag, and walk across the street. One of the neighbors steps out of his house to get the mail and sees me as I approach the front door. "They're not home," he calls to me across the yard. "They've gone to church." "That's just fine," I say back. "I just need to check the lines in their backyard." We've already spoken with them on the phone. I shoot the man a friendly, innocent smile and continue to the backyard. He smiles back and begins to flip through his mail. I unlatch the gate and let myself into the backyard. I survey the area to make sure that no other nosy neighbors are going to interrupt me, and I go to the back door. I have a pick set in my bag along with a few other tools of the trade, but that won't be necessary here. All of the locks have a keyless entry number pad, the code to which just so happens to be the last 4 digits of their only son's telephone number. I punch the code in and hear the deadbolt click. I hear a security alarm begin to beep from the hallway, notifying me that I have 30 seconds to disarm the system before emergency services are notified. I close the door behind me and hurry to the security box on the wall and punch in the code, the same code as before, and the system changes from armed to disarmed. It's advised to use the same code for the security as you did for your doors, but the elderly couldn't remember all the numbers and often had their system either lock them out or contact police while they were trying to remember. 90% of the time, the code to the door was the same for the security system, and if it wasn't, it probably had the same theme. With the system disarmed, I was able to tour the house. I had 3 hours, but I wanted to be long gone by then, so it would be a short tour. As expected, the house was adorned with exotic decorations and antiques from all over the world. There were paintings everywhere, which probably cost several $1,000s each, but I was never much into art. Selling art was hard unless you had something stolen from a museum, in which case you could sell it, but usually ended up in prison anyway. What I was interested in was in the bedroom. I made my way up the long staircase leading to the second level of the house and to the end of the hallway where the master bedroom was located. A large 4-poster bed stood in the middle of the room with 4 oak pillars on each corner. A jetted hot tub was at the far end of the room with a television screen mounted on the wall above it, and the furniture in the room consisted of finely crafted dressers and vanity tables and other such items made of polished ebony. I took only a second to take this all in before going over to the closet in the corner. It was a panel with no indication that it was actually a door, except for a small crease where the wall started and the door ended. I pushed on the panel and it popped open with a click. At the top of the closet was a television monitor which displayed the feed from the security cameras. A black box below that had a red light that indicated a live recording. I found the remote and deleted all stored data from that day and stopped the live recording process. I was now invisible. At the bottom of the closet was a large black safe, complete with a massive dial in the center and a silver handle to the left of it. This is what I'd come for. I had no idea what was in the safe, but I saw them through the window frequently opening and closing the safe. They never took anything in or out, but every night came to look at whatever was in the safe. When they opened the safe, it seemed to me that they were just checking to see that whatever was in there was still actually there, instead of visiting something of sentimental value. They would dial in the combination, peek inside, then close it again. Sometimes they would touch it or call the other person over to look, but never took it out. Whatever it was, they wanted to keep it safe, and given their expensive taste in decorations and furniture, this was probably something of immense value. I bent over and tried the few combinations I could guess: birthdays, anniversaries, and so on. Nothing worked, not that I expected it to, because safes like this often come with a code from the manufacturer, but I came prepared for that. In the underground world of misfits and criminals, I'm what's known as a Jaeger safe cracker. Cracking safes is what got me into burglarizing houses in the first place. I picked it up as a hobby when I was a teenager and found that I had a natural talent for it. I took out my equipment and went to work, listening with a stethoscope to the subtle clicks made by the dial as I slowly spun it. As I worked, I fantasized about what I might find in the safe. Would I find some rare jewel or artifact? Drugs, perhaps. Those were my 2 best guesses, although both seemed equally implausible. It took me almost an hour to crack the safe, and by that point I'd used up half my time, which was just fine considering I had an hour and a half to collect whatever I wanted from the house and get out of Dodge. When I twisted the handle to the safe counterclockwise, I heard the inner workings of the safe move and let out a heavy clunk as the bars inside the door slid into their slots. I pulled the door, which was surprisingly heavy for such a small safe, to reveal the contents within. In my wildest dreams, I could have never imagined what I found lying in the safe. It was a pair of human hands. They were an ashy gray color, and the fingers on each hand were curled slightly, as if grasping an invisible baseball, reminding me of the curled legs of a dead spider. I didn't need to investigate further to know that they were real. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. It was that same feeling you get when you stand in a graveyard or drive past a fatal car accident. One was the hand of a man, wrinkled and calloused, and had gray hairs on the knuckles. The other was that of an old woman, with manicured fingernails and dainty, thin fingers. I pulled a pen light from my pocket and clicked it on to get a better look. They seemed like they'd been there for a while, maybe a few weeks or even months, with skin that looked like leather, and black coagulated blood on the stump just above the wrist. The smell, which hadn't occurred to me until now from the shock of seeing the disembodied hands in the safe, was wretched. I raised a hand to my face and covered my mouth and nose, clenching my teeth to keep myself from throwing up. I thought for a moment about what I wanted to do about my discovery, but I knew the answer already. This didn't change anything. I would still take what I wanted and be gone. If the Manchesters wanted to keep hands in a safe, that was their business and I didn't need to have any part of it. I closed the safe and closet and carried my bag out of the room. I worked quickly to take what I wanted and leave. I always got a rush doing this, but after seeing those hands I just wanted to get out with the loot as soon as possible. I was on the top floor, taking a tribal mask off the wall in the hallway when I heard voices downstairs. I checked my watch, which told me I still should have plenty of time before my 3 hours were up, but fate doesn't work on a schedule. The voices I heard were that of Mr. and Mrs. Manchester, and they were asking each other if the other had set the security alarm before leaving. I wanted to hit myself in the forehead, but refrained. I'd forgotten to rearm the security. It was a mistake that next to never comes back to haunt you, but when it did, it was cruel. If I'd rearmed the security alarm, I'd know when someone entered the house. I thought the 3 hours was a given, so I'd been careless. Now, this burglary had become a robbery, and if I got caught, the sentence would be that much worse. I slipped into one of the bedrooms and listened for their next move. The room I was in seemed to be a spare bedroom, so it seemed like a pretty safe hiding spot for now. I would wait until they were either in another room or otherwise occupied. Then I'd slip out the back. I heard them climbing the stairs slowly and my heart began to race. I was oddly exhilarated by the thought of being caught in a way I didn't expect. It was like getting an extra hit of heroin when you weren't expecting it. It was intoxicating. I heard their footsteps hit the hardwood floor and make their way to the bedroom, probably to take one of their typical Sunday naps, when they stopped suddenly. "Someone's been here," Winston Manchester said. "Things are missing off our walls." Instead of the panic which I'd expected to ensue, or even a suggestion to call the police, I heard something I hadn't expected. I heard sniffing. Not like the sound someone makes when they're sick, but something different. The inhalations were long and drawn and the exhalations were broken. It was an innate, predatory sound like a wolf catching the scent of a lamb. It made my blood turn to ice. "He's still here," Mary said. My mouth went dry and my palms began to sweat. The sound of footsteps approached, and I knew I had to make a bold move if I was to get out and away without being arrested. I reached into the bag and pulled out the mask I'd just taken off of the wall and put it on. It had a leather strap which I had to tie to my face and felt awkward and uncomfortable, but it would work for now. It was on just as Mr. and Mrs. Manchester came around the corner. They stared at me for a moment with curiosity. I'm sure I was quite a sight to see, wearing an old African mask and a bright orange vest. "Who are you?" Mary asked. She didn't seem scared whatsoever, but curious. She looked me up and down. "What are you doing here?" I didn't know how to answer, so I ignored her question. "Go to your bedroom and close the door and I won't hurt you." Winston smiled wryly. "He won't hurt us," he said in a mocking tone. Just then, I saw something unusual happen to Winston Manchester's eyes. The pupils dilated so far that the irises couldn't be seen. I had a sudden dark realization then that there was much more than my freedom at stake here. My life was somehow on the line, and that thought made my skin tighten and my palms sweat. I needed to get out of there. The bag I held had about 30 or 40 pounds of stolen loot in it, and with all my strength I flung it at the elderly couple and rushed forward. Winston knocked the bag out of the air with surprising ease, but the surprise of my action was enough for me to slip past them and into the hallway. Mrs. Manchester let out a strange hiss, and I felt her hand, strong somehow, take hold on my vest. I unbuckled the front and slipped it off, bolting forward toward the stairs. I heard them moving behind me, and I thought for a moment that I could make it, but then something I could never have expected happened. I heard another hiss, but not from behind me where I expected. The hiss came from above me. I looked up and saw Mary Manchester on the ceiling above me. Her gray hair hung down in her face and her neck was twisted around so that I could see her eyes between the strands of hair. They were just as dark as Mr. Manchester. Her tongue lolled out of her mouth and wriggled like an electrified slug. I bolted for the stairs, and in my haste, I tripped over my own feet and tumbled down the winding staircase. Each barrel roll my body made was painful, and when I felt my shoulder pop and the heat radiate from it, the last 2 rotations became excruciating. I landed at the bottom of the staircase with a thud and tried to sit up, but the world around me was spinning either from the 6 or so rotations I'd made or from the pain. I couldn't tell which. The hiss at the top of the stairs snapped me back into reality, if that's really what I was experiencing now, and as my vision came into focus I saw Mr. and Mrs. Manchester standing at the top of the staircase. Their arms hung at their sides and both of their heads were cocked to the left, like curious dogs, staring at me through eyes like black marbles. I sat up and the remains of the mask I'd been wearing fell from my face in pieces. I scrambled to my feet, accidentally putting weight on my left shoulder and regretting it instantly. I turned on my heels and ran for the nearest door and threw myself inside. Behind me I heard the loud footsteps of my pursuers, and as I closed the door behind me, I was plunged into darkness, but I didn't need to see to find the doorknob and flick the lock. Just as I did this, I felt the doorknob jiggle and heard the pounding and clawing and screaming on the other side of the door. It was a heavy door, probably solid oak or redwood, so I hoped it would hold for at least a minute or two, but I didn't want to take any bets on that. I needed to barricade it. I pulled the flashlight out of my pocket and flicked it on. I found myself standing at the top of a staircase. Had I taken a step backward, I would have found myself falling down another flight of stairs and likely would have broken my neck. I followed the staircase down to the basement level of the house. At the bottom of the staircase on the wall to my left was a light switch. I flicked it up and the room was illuminated by the light fixtures in the ceiling. Like the rest of the house, the basement was furnished with more antique artifacts on the walls. The room I was standing in appeared to be a rec room, complete with a large television, pool table, and air hockey, but those things weren't what drew my attention. The first thing I noticed above all else was the blood that was smeared over almost every surface of the room in some fashion. There were long streaks that had turned from what I was sure once a bright red to now dry, rust-colored stains along the floor, walls, couches, and so on. Against the wall stood a chest with a lace doily and a lamp on it. I hurried to the chest, hoping it was heavy, and tried to move it. I guessed it was at least 100 pounds, which would be perfect for what I needed. My left shoulder was dislocated for sure, so I only had one good arm to move the chest with. I muscled the chest to the bottom of the staircase, then worked on pushing it up the stairs. It took a few minutes to move it with only one hand, and by the end my brow was doused in sweat, but I'd been able to successfully blockade the door against my aggressors and had earned myself time to think. Back down at the bottom of the stairs, I noticed a trail of dried blood leading either to or from one of the rooms on the far side of where I stood. I debated what to do for only a moment, ultimately deciding to follow the trail because I doubted that what I would find in that room would compare to the horrors which still pounded and shrieked on the other side of the basement door. I grabbed a pool cue as I crossed the room, not sure what else I could use as a weapon. I paused just before entering the next room and listened for any sound other than the sounds made by Winston and Mary Manchester. When I was satisfied, I entered the room. I wasn't sure what I'd expected when I saw what lay before me, but the mangled bodies of Mary and Winston Manchester had not been it. Their bodies lay together on the ground with chunks of flesh missing from their bones and a dry pool of blood around them. Their faces were intact, though, for the most part, well enough for me to identify who they were and to know that they'd been dead for a long time, probably weeks. The scent of death still hung in the air, but not as badly as it had in the safe, probably due to the improved air circulation in the basement. I knelt to investigate the bodies further and noticed two things that made me realize that my chances of survival were much worse than I'd imagined. First, both bodies were missing one hand. It didn't take long for me to conclude that the hands in the safe were those of the late Mary and Winston Manchester, although why they were locked away I couldn't yet say. The second thing that I noticed about the bodies that made my skin crawl was the small grooves in the bones where the muscle and tissue and skin had been ripped away. They were teeth marks. Someone or something had been eating them. I recoiled from the bodies and began to retch uncontrollably. My breakfast climbed up my throat and spilled onto the blood-stained carpet. What the fuck had I gotten myself into? And how the fuck was I going to get out? I wiped the water from my eyes and the spittle from the corners of my mouth and considered my situation. I had really only a handful of scenarios I had to prepare for, and those could really be broken down to the two innate reactions to danger: fight or flight. I chose flight. I quickly toured the basement to see what I had to work with. Most rooms had subterranean windows with window wells that could easily be climbed through. The only decision I had left to make was which window. I chose the window in the room with the chewed-up remains of Winston and Mary Manchester. It would let me into the backyard, so I would hopefully have time to climb out and get to sprinting before I was found out. If I went through the front, I ran the risk of being seen through one of the many large front-facing windows. I opened the window and began to climb out, trying to be as gentle with my left arm as possible, and it was at that moment that I realized my mistake. In my haste, I hadn't noticed that the screaming and the pounding at the basement door had stopped. I was only halfway through the window when I felt a pair of strong hands on my shoulders. The hands pulled me up and out of the window well, and I was tossed fact first onto the grass. I scrambled to get up, but I felt another pair of hands on my feet. I raised my head and saw the face of Winston Manchester staring back at me, only inches from my nose. His eyes were black, and I saw that his teeth were jagged and crooked, as if they'd been carved out of broken glass. He smiled at me, and his breath was hot and putrid. The hands that held my legs moved up my body, and I was lifted off the ground like a rag doll. I kicked and screamed against Mary Manchester, who flung me over her shoulder, as if I were nothing more than a misbehaving child. I clawed at her head and beat my fists against her back and kicked my feet, but nothing I did made her falter even a step. The creature impersonating Winston followed behind us with the Cheshire grin across his face and his dark predatory eyes never moving from mine. I was carried into a shed at the far end of the yard, where I was abruptly plopped into a chair. "Open your mouth," Mary said. I locked my jaw closed. "Open your mouth," she repeated. I didn't move. I frantically searched my surroundings. I was sitting in a wooden chair with leather straps on the armrests. Along the walls hung various gardening tools: rakes, shovels, pitchforks, loppers, and so on. If I could get to one, any of them would be a fantastic tool, but the hard part would be actually crossing the shed. It was only maybe 12 by 12 inches, and with 3 of us inside it felt much smaller. My scan of the room completed with the object next to which I sat. It was an old table saw, and my chair was butted right up against it. It looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The blade and the metal platform were covered in rust, and clumps of old sawdust had collected along the outer rim of the platform. Winston Manchester stepped forward, pushing Mary aside then, and grabbed a tight hold of my nose. It was painful, and I could feel blood building up inside my closed nostrils. I knew what he was trying to do, and I knew it was going to work, but I held my breath as long as I could, kicking and clawing at him the whole time. My chest burned, and the corners of my vision had begun to turn black by the time I finally opened my mouth and let the air into my lungs. Winston released my nose, and a small trickle of blood began to drip from my upper lip. I got only about half of a lungful before a dusty rag was stuffed into my mouth. I choked on it and my eyes watered, and I moved to let it out, but suddenly the leather straps were tightened against my left wrist. Mary giggled like a schoolgirl and began to dance around like an excited child. Winston took a hold of my right forearm and slammed it on the saw platform next to me. It was then that I realized the saw wasn't covered in rust, it was covered in blood. I fought and screamed and pulled away, but Winston didn't seem to pay any attention whatsoever. He clicked a button and the saw sprung to life. The blade moved faster until I couldn't discern the individual teeth. It was just one single vibrating object. I bit against the rag, thankful for it then, because without it I was sure that my teeth would have been cracked from the force of my jaw as it clamped down in reaction to the pain. When the saw blade bit against my skin, it felt hot at first. I didn't feel any pain whatsoever. Then, like a gunshot, the pain exploded up my arm and I felt every single tooth of the saw blade as it cut deeper into my flesh, then my muscle, and finally my bone. When it did reach the bone of my wrist, the saw whined for a moment against the change in density, but it never faltered. When the saw reached the end of my wrist, my forearm was suddenly released, and I pulled the bloody stump to my chest and sobbed and screamed through the cloth. Mary picked up my hand from the table saw and examined it closely, as if appraising its value. Blood dripped from the severed wrist. She caught a droplet on her finger and brought it to her lips. Without another word, the couple turned around and left the trailer. They slammed the door shut, and I heard the click of a padlock on the other end. I sat in the dark, dazed from the loss of blood and exhausted from the pain. I knew I needed to move, but I didn't seem to have the strength or energy to do so. I was losing blood quickly and could feel the effects on my body already. With an effort, I worked to get my wrist free. I had to bend low and use my teeth to get it free and focus everything I had to ignore the pain in my right arm and my left shoulder. It took me 45 minutes to free myself, and by then I was even worse off and my teeth ached. I had to stop the bleeding, or at least slow it down, but before I could do that I had to get my left arm functional again. My left arm hung limply by my side. I'd seen videos of dislocated joints in the past, and several wherein a friend knocks the joint back into place. I didn't have the luxury of a friend, so I would have to do it myself. I put the rag I'd spit out back into my mouth, then put my left hand on the seat of the chair. I locked my elbow and closed my eyes and tried to picture being somewhere else, away from this shed, and threw all my weight onto my arm. The pain was agonizing, and I felt it radiate from my shoulder to my stomach and down to my testicles. I fell to the ground, clutching the stump of my severed wrist to my chest. It was still bleeding terribly, and now I had to address that. I took my shirt off and tore it into two pieces with my left hand and teeth. One piece I tied around the stump as tightly as I could. The other piece was tied just past my elbow to help slow the flow of blood to the missing appendage. 30 seconds later, I blacked out. When I awoke, it was to total darkness. For a moment, I thought I'd been somehow blinded or maybe I'd died, and this was the afterlife. But then I noticed a thin sliver of dim light coming from the bottom of the shed door, and I simultaneously understood where I was and how long I'd been out. The sun had set, and the light I was seeing was either moonlight or the light from a neighboring house. I sat up groggily, trying to remember what all was real and what I'd dreamt. Without thinking, I raised my hands up to my face, except only one hand touched my cheek. I looked down, my eyes having adjusted to the dark now, and saw the stump covered in my bloody shirt. None of that had been a dream. The pain in my shoulder and wrist ached terribly, but for now I could manage to think. I'd evidently not bled out and still had a chance of survival. All I had to do now was escape the shed. I staggered to my feet and felt a rush of disorientation and had to sit down in the chair for a moment. As I sat, I looked around the room. There were plenty of tools hanging on the walls, so I could probably use one of those to break the lock or bust down the door. I stood up, pausing for a moment to ensure that I wouldn't pass out again, and walked to the door. I put my weight against it and felt it give a little. I could probably break it down. I went to kick it when I suddenly stopped, thinking about the noise I would make by doing this. Surely the creatures that had put me there would hear my escape attempt and would return to either kill me or make sure I didn't have any other means of escape. I sat back down in the chair, feeling nauseous now, but desperately not wanting to throw up. I needed to think about this before I did anything, but I needed to do it quickly. I was lucky as hell that they hadn't come back to finish me off while I was out, but there was no way I wanted to take any more of that luck to the bank. I needed to escape, but first I needed to make sure that I was ready for them. I searched in the dark shed to see what I had at my disposal and began to slowly formulate a plan. It must have been an hour later when the creatures posing as the Manchesters heard the loud smash as I kicked the shed door with everything I had. It took 3 hard kicks before I heard the satisfying crack as the metal holding the lock in place began to break against the force. 2 more hard kicks and I nearly stumbled out onto the lawn. The night air hit my face and I realized then just how hot it had been in the shed. I heard footsteps approaching to my left and I retreated back into the shed for what would be the last time. Mr. Manchester must have seen me duck back in, because without hesitation he lunged through the threshold of the shed and toward me, but I'd anticipated this. I held a small bucket filled with gasoline which I had siphoned from the lawnmower. I had set it on the shelf so it wouldn't spill during my escape, but now it was poised in my hands for attack. As soon as the creature was within range, I threw the gasoline into his face. It wasn't much, but it did the trick. The toxic liquid poured into the man's eyes and mouth, and he grabbed his face and howled, stumbling back toward the pitchfork which I had propped up against the corner of the shed. If I had both arms working, I would have used the pitchfork myself, but being that the one good hand I had was still throbbing from the pain of dislocation, I knew I wouldn't be able to put enough force behind the jab I would need to successfully kill the man. The metal tines of the pitchfork glimmered in the starlight, ready and waiting for something to bite into. I shoved Mr. Manchester as hard as I could into the corner of the shed and heard the wet crunching sound as the metal tines of the fork pierced his flesh. He howled in pain and grabbed at his stomach, which was now pouring blood, and I knew I'd done it. Mrs. Manchester hadn't been as fast as her husband, so as I had impaled her husband with the pitchfork, she was just getting to the mouth of the shed. She wailed and lurched toward me with everything she had. She grabbed me before I could move, clutching both shoulders tightly, but I didn't cry out. Instead, I spat the mouthful of gasoline which I had stored in my cheeks into her face. She let go of me immediately and her hands instinctually flew to her eyes. I ran out of the shed as fast as I could. I hoped that with gasoline in her eyes, she'd be slower than I was, even though I was exhausted and had lost a lot of blood. All I needed to do was to make it to the street. I just had to get out of the backyard and make it to the street. I got to the gate separating the backyard from the front and found it locked. The whole yard was bordered with an 8-foot wooden fence, and I didn't think I had the time to try breaking the lock. I turned around to verify my fear and saw that Mrs. Manchester was already coming toward me at full speed. Her eyes were black in the center and extremely bloodshot, giving her an even more terrifying look than before. I turned and ran for the house. My legs pumped and my heart raced as I ran for my life toward the back door. I could feel a growing wetness in my makeshift bandage and knew that I'd reopened the wound on my wrist. I could hear her only feet away from me when I got to the house and slammed the back door. I didn't bother locking it because I knew she would just break the glass eye of the window and let herself in anyway. I darted across the house, dodging furniture as I went, and I'd nearly escaped when I felt the toe of my left shoe catch against the edge of the Persian rug in the front room. I tumbled forward, throwing my arms out without thinking and landing painfully on my formerly dislocated shoulder and current bloody stump of a wrist. I howled in pain and clambered to my feet, but just before I could catch my balance, I felt a hard shove at my back. I fell forward again, narrowly missing the corner of an end table with my skull. I twisted around just in time for Mrs. Manchester to land on top of me. Her knees dug into my shoulders and I cried out painfully. Her face was contorted in an inhuman grimace, and her teeth bared at me with the same sick jaggedness I'd seen before. Strands of saliva hung down from her mouth like a wild animal before a meal. My hand searched frantically for anything I could use and my eyes wildly scanned the area. I'm not sure if my hand or my eyes found it first, but next to my left hip, fallen from the end table I'd nearly smashed into, was an old ceramic lamp. I clutched the base and cracked it against Mrs. Manchester's skull as hard as I could. The lamp shattered, and Mrs. Manchester was knocked off balance enough for me to push her off of me. I leapt to my feet and toward the door while Mrs. Manchester attempted the same thing. She was screaming, and the side of her face was covered in black blood. I cleared the remaining 6 feet to the door, clicked the lock open, and myself threw it into the night air. I was taken to the hospital by a neighbor who found me passed out in his front yard. I would later learn that it was the same neighbor who had waved at me as he checked the mail and I posed as a worker from the power company. A year went by before the doctor appointments finally stopped. I had to go to physical therapy to learn how to do my daily activities with only one hand. 6 months went by before the nightmares stopped, and another 6 before I stopped my weekly visits to my therapist. Mr. and Mrs. Manchester were never apprehended, and although a few of the neighbors reported seeing Mary Manchester after that night, nobody ever saw Winston again, giving me hope that I'd actually managed to kill the creature masquerading as the elderly man. Some nights I stay awake, wondering where the second creature went. I often find myself thinking of it as Mary or Mrs. Manchester simply because I have no idea what else to call it. Was she still around, or had she fled to wherever she'd come from? This answer plagued me for a long time, causing sleepless nights and panic attacks on a regular basis. I can't be sure, but I think I may have just gotten my answer. I took my dog to the park the other day, wanting to enjoy the fresh air and agreeable weather before the rain started up again. I had just gotten to the park and was looking for the right spot to unleash my dog for a game of fetch when I saw that I was already sitting on the park bench next to the playground. I stood there in stunned horror as I watched the other version of me look up and make eye contact with me and flash me a crooked smile. It looked exactly like me, except for 2 key differences. 1, its teeth were jagged and broken, and 2, it had both of its hands.
That's the end of the story. Comment down your views about the story, and if you liked it, then give it a thumbs up. Also do subscribe for more content like this.